Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Grow Conversations podcast. My name is Alex Fraser. I'm your host today. I'm also patient access specialist at Grow Pharma. And our guest on today's show is Dr. Leon Barron. Leon is a GP, a general practitioner here working in the UK. So Leon, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Lovely to have you here. And I guess just to start things off, it'd be lovely to hear a little bit about your background and perhaps sort of your journey and how you found yourself working in the cannabis space.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm a GP, as you rightly say. I primarily work in the NHS, so I work in clinical practice. I do quite a bit of urgent care, out of hours work, one-on-one type work. I do a little bit of tutoring at UCL for undergraduate medical students. And yeah, I have an interest in medical cannabis. That came about really 2 or 3 years ago when I actually heard of a relative of mine overseas, an elderly relative who was using medical cannabis for sort of chronic pain, osteoporosis, really poor quality of life. And I saw a huge transformation actually. It just ignited my interest in it. I went online, I read up on Raphael Mechoulam and his work, and then discovered loads of interesting papers online through PubMed and interesting videos online and patient stories and so on. And I couldn't get away from the fact that there's something in cannabis. There's clearly medical properties, life-changing properties for some. And that sparked an interest for me. Soon after this time, I met Professor Mike Barrons, who was very active and still is in the cannabis space. And actually, he was just setting up at that time the MCCS, the Medical Cannabis Clinician Society. So I got involved with his work, and subsequently have put together a project just really for GPs, aiming at GPs. And I guess I'm driven by the fact that I believe that this is a very good and useful treatment option for some patients, and it serves a clinical need. And I think we need to kind of raise awareness of medical cannabis, and really it should be something that's more broadly understood by general practitioners and specialists and patients and everyone really, because clearly it's useful.
Sure.
So,
I think it's really interesting that you bring up your sort of the family member and that story, and that's something I hear a lot, is that you have a relative or a friend or someone who is treating a condition and has, for want of a better word, sort of a miraculous experience where other medicines haven't worked, and the cannabis medicines then are, greatly improving their quality of life. And I think it's that quite that level of impact it has to the individual is so shocking, I guess, from the point of view of someone who's watching externally, and that immediately inspires this sort of, well, there must be something more to this. There must be more going on here. And I guess it's interesting to hear your perspective from a sort of GP point of view. So it's worth sort of prefacing for our viewers that the legislation, the rescheduling of 2018, specified that only specialists can prescribe. So this sort of cuts out GPs. Is that pretty much how this works?
In essence, yes. I would say that largely speaking, the majority of GPs are not particularly necessarily interested in learning about medical cannabis, and probably because we're not being allowed to initiate scripts. Saying that, however, there is clearly increased awareness of medical cannabis through media and patient groups and patients that may know someone that's using it, or read up on something, or they're using over-the-counter CBD. So what's happening in practice is more patients are discussing the subject with their doctors, and I think some GPs are quite open to talking about it and learning more about it. And unfortunately, others aren't, because perhaps their mind's made up already that cannabis is a bad drug, or they've seen the negative effects of cannabis throughout training or throughout their lives. So there's definitely a disparity between sort of say the demand of patients or what their expectations may be around cannabis treatments and what in reality can be offered to them. So you briefly mentioned the legislation change, which excludes GPs as primary prescribers. And if you look at the small print and even look at NICE guidelines, GPs can prescribe in theory under a shared care arrangement, but in practice it's not really happening, and that's because the majority of cannabis-based medicines are not available through the NHS, and that there are exceptions, of course, with Sativex and Epidiolex, which are licensed products for very specific conditions, but they tend to be managed in secondary care of neurologists or pediatrics and so on. So actually, GPs don't really need to know a lot about this. Purely, well, I say that unless they want to, there's they're not expected to be prescribers. They're not really expected to know a great deal about it. My view is that we should know more about it. We should understand it, particularly as a lot of our patients are using recreational, illicit street cannabis for medical use. So for that reason, I do think we need to understand it. We also need to understand CBD products that a lot of people are now using to perhaps control symptoms that haven't been well controlled with conventional therapeutics, prescribed pharmaceutical type treatments. So yeah, there's this is an area that's we're learning more and more about, and we're discovering more about. But clearly, there's a good clinical role for this type of medicine, and I think we have a duty to understand it as frontline doctors.
Yeah, I guess it's worth giving a sort of an idea to those who are watching that the GP is in a sense sort of a gateway for healthcare for patients. It's the first point of call, and the GP's role is sort of obviously to assess the patient and sort of get an idea of what's wrong, and then potentially refer them to other specialists if necessary, or prescribe other certain drugs, and play very much a gateway role in that sense. So I suppose the question is, do you have a lot of patients coming to you discussing cannabis in your surgery, and then how do you deal with that, with the sort of inability to prescribe, and obviously the fact that there's no NHS access really to other than the few drugs that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I've noticed an increasing number of patients who excuse me, are bringing this up as a conversation point. A lot of my patients don't even know that I have a strong interest in medical cannabis, so I tend not to discuss it unless it comes to me, and that's partly because I don't think it's fair in some ways to raise expectations for patients or give them false hope, because unfortunately, as things stand, most patients are only going to be able to access full spectrum cannabis-based products through private clinics, and a lot of my patients wouldn't be able to afford that. So, but certainly, if I'm asked about cannabis, I can, hopefully explain a bit more about how it can work and how it can help for certain things. You mentioned the role of GPs as being gatekeepers. Mm-hmm. Now, what I think we're also very good at in primary care and general practice is overseeing lots of complex overlapping conditions and symptoms. So although we're taught in medical school, and the reality of clinical modern medicine is that we break things up into systems and we refer to specialists. So, you've got a neurological problem, you go and see your neurologist. You're in pain, you refer to a pain specialist. You've got inflammatory bowel disease, you see a gastroenterologist. But the reality is that a lot of these that humans and people are not, we don't fall into neat categories with symptoms or this or that. And actually, a lot of, if you're in chronic pain and suffering with pain, then your sleep will inevitably be affected, or your mood will be often, it has an impact on mood in your work or your relationships at home and other things like that. And that's the job of the GP. We end up trying to manage these overlapping symptoms, and that's where I think we greatly differ from a lot of specialists, in that we're very well placed to manage those types of symptoms and those problems, and that's really what we're trained to do. So actually, you could argue that we're perhaps better placed for these types of treatment, this type of medication, because it's a very kind of, it's quality. You speak to patients overseas who have been prescribed cannabis, and you find that it's more of a kind of quality of life medicine. It can improve a little bit of sleep or pain, or your mood slightly improves. And actually, that's, I think, where it really comes into its own. And that's where I think GPs are very well positioned to be prescribers and to oversee treatment as well.
I was going to say, I'm loath to use the word holistic, but
yeah.
I do feel like there is perhaps some aspect of that, particularly with regards to cannabis medicines, and that's due to the endocannabinoid system and its role in quite so many. And this is a paradigm that I have to sort of explain to people quite a lot, because I think a lot of the time some of the criticism of perhaps the medical cannabis advocacy space is that it's sort of suggesting cannabis for almost everything.
Yeah.
And the word panacea is thrown about, and obviously it's not that at all, but it does play a role in, and the endocannabinoid system plays a role in so many different biological processes, and that's why cannabis medicines are so helpful for such a wide range. And like you say, it's not just purely about direct symptom management, but also mood, sleep, appetite, and things that have a sort of indirect impact. And I know from personal experience with an inflammatory bowel disease, how much stress, a lack of sleep, or a poor appetite can then have a knock-on effect that worsens the disease and can put you in quite dire straits if it gets severe. So it's interesting that you bring that up. It's sort of fascinating to get an understanding of how the sort of GP role works, and I guess it's sad to hear that that's not being fully or that cannabis medicines aren't quite reaching into that remit at this point, because it seems to me that it's an obvious place where these medicines would be useful for, like I say, for these more mild but impactful symptoms, like I say, like an appetite issues.
And also, if you look overseas, I mean, there's 50 plus countries now where cannabis has been legalized for medical use, and the majority of the prescribers are GPs, for the very reasons we touched upon, that we're in a good position to follow up patients as well. Often, because these treatments it's not an exact science as things stand, in that the doses have to be titrated, or you have to try different strains or different products, that actually, patients would need very close monitoring certainly over the first few weeks and few months. That's very hard to do in secondary care, because a lot of specialists don't have the time or the resources to do that. So what's interesting, if you look even in Europe, Germany and Luxembourg, Denmark, Holland, a lot of GPs are prescribing because they're well placed to prescribe. And actually, I think what's happened here with only allowing specialists, and sort of this idea that cannabis through the analysis by NICE is that cannabis-based medicines are not cost-effective as things stand. Actually, I think what's happened by restricting access is that we've actually allowed a private we've allowed the private clinics to appear, because cannabis is not really being treated as just another medication that we can use in our toolbox, but it's kind of put on this pedestal as something alternative and different. And actually, I think that's a shame, because I personally think cannabis medicine should be just one tool in a toolbox of medications that we can prescribe and offer to patients. So I would love to see GPs being allowed to prescribe. I think it was wrong that we weren't allowed to prescribe, because specialists don't know any more about cannabis than GPs did from the outset, because none of us were taught about it in medical school. So I think it was an oversight that actually we weren't allowed to initiate prescription. We're still not able to do that. And actually, we don't need all GPs to want to prescribe or to want to understand this. It may just be that 5% of GPs in the UK are interested in it. They want to learn about it. They're willing to prescribe. They're happy to prescribe, and it only needs a small proportion to serve the population. That it could be that we have specialist GPs that take referrals from other colleagues and that they can oversee the prescribing of cannabis.
When obviously we're all sort of waiting for that sort of data to roll out, and I guess I'm not presumptive that you'll have the answer, but what's your take on why the legislation specified only specialists? Do you have any sort of insights into why you think that was? Or
I can only speculate that the legislation was rushed through, perhaps because of high-profile media cases. The law was changed. It was reactive to a situation, and it hadn't really gone through the normal, rigorous sort of processes that take place when a new medicine is rolled out. But this is the case with cannabis medicine across the world, that it's kind of in reverse from the normal process of bringing a drug to market, in that people are already using it. It's been used for millennia, and it's patients want it. A lot of people have a strong opinion on it, and actually the doctors and the royal colleges and NICE and the medical establishment, which is rightly so kind of our gold standard and what we kind of all adhere to, is kind of almost coming on it towards the end of that process, and are trying to kind of find a way to navigate this. I do understand I do also understand the concerns about perhaps a lack of RCTs and placebo-controlled trials and safety data. But I think you could, the counter argument for that is that we do actually know a lot about cannabis as a medicine and as a plant, and its active compounds. We're learning more and more all the time, and actually it's quite obvious. So from particularly overseas in Germany and other areas where cannabis is being used extensively, that the data can be collected at the same time as prescribing and serving the needs of patients. And look, I think as long as patients are informed and they understand that perhaps that most of these medications are licensed, they've not been through pharmaceutical style licensing trials and so on. As long as they understand that, I think that's reasonable then for a sort of, as a patient-centered approach to management and prescribing, that that actually, we can serve the needs of patients, but also try and address some of those other factors that clearly do need to be addressed. And until we build the evidence base and perhaps reassure more doctors, then we are going to continue to kind of try and persuade people to come on board, GPs and other prescribers to come on board. Sorry, that's a long, convoluted answer.
Well, no, but it answers perfectly, and I think you hit on a lot of interesting points. I think the idea of this sort of patient-centered care, and that sort of is a new paradigm perhaps in healthcare, where it's becoming more. There's more of a focus on sort of the patient having more authority in terms of their healthcare. But I do think it's important that we have that authority of the doctors, and sort of the buck stops there in terms of that responsibility for prescribing. And I guess it's the frustration from a patient point of view is if you're going to your GP as a point of access to medicines, and the GP isn't necessarily informed about cannabis medicines, and the other treatments haven't worked or haven't been successful. And these patients are then going to, like I say, over-the-counter CBD. You bring that up, which of course isn't a pharmaceutical product, and obviously with no doctor oversight there, and potentially poor regulation in that space. Patients aren't necessarily getting what they need, or even what they think they're purchasing. And obviously, further than that, with patients who feel they need a THC, they're obviously then sort of redirected, as it were, towards the black market. So perhaps the legislation is in some way failing patients, in that we're not preparing GPs to really assist with that sort of pathway, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned patient-centered care. There's a great emphasis on, in medical school training and GP training, postgraduate training, that we take on much more of a joint decision making with patients, that they're actively involved in decisions about their own care, and more autonomy. It comes with other problems, in that a lot of doctors or GPs don't want to be necessarily told what's best for someone, because there are lots of other alternative or complementary treatments that patients might want, or they may demand, that aren't appropriate, or they may be unsafe. So I don't sort of brush over that lightly, that some doctors feel very uneasy about being told what to prescribe, or what might be good for that person. But I think cannabis just seems to be slightly different, perhaps in that it's already being used extensively by patients for unmet clinical needs. So I think it's about 1.5 million people in the UK using street cannabis to help with either sleep or chronic pain or mood disorders and other things like that. So it's kind of staring us in the face that it's being used, but people are being driven to the black market to access products, whereas that same patient living in Holland or Germany or Israel or Canada, Australia, for example, would be able to obtain the equivalent product, but it's safer, cleaner, standardized. And that, for me, just seems the right approach, in that, we're trained as doctors to look after people and manage them and manage their symptoms and improve their lives. And this, I think we just need to kind of move forwards now with this and try and find a way that it sits in our clinical practice, and that we get doctors on board that understand it and comfortable prescribing.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And you mentioned it a bit earlier when you were talking about these cannabis clinics opening up, specializing in and naming themselves as cannabis clinics. And I think that I think it's really important that we are putting cannabis alongside other treatments, so that it's one of the options that doctors have.
And it might not be right for a lot of people. A lot of patients probably don't need it, or it's not indicated. And I think that's where the doctor really plays an important role to work out if it's appropriate. I mentioned that most of these whole plant products are unlicensed. We prescribe a lot of other medications off license. There's a huge number that we prescribe daily as GPs that haven't been through strict clinical trials for that particular symptom or dose, for example. So just because it's unlicensed doesn't mean we shouldn't be open to using it or prescribing it. Most pediatric drugs are not licensed for that, because there's difficulties in putting children through large clinical trials. And also there's lots of medications that haven't been through RCTs as well, that have come to become licensed in the US or Europe. So it's a hurdle, but it's certainly something that we should be getting more used to or more comfortable with as doctors.
Sure. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about your work with the Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society, and there's also the other organisation, the Primary Care Cannabis Network. Obviously, it sort of does what it says on the tin a little bit there. Primary care is the focus of the latter there. What sort of differentiates these two organisations, and what are you doing with each?
So the MCCS is the Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society, that's made up of a number of different specialists on our committee. So we've got pain specialists, psychiatry, general physicians, neurologists, paediatrics, and we meet regularly to sort of discuss how we can try and shape the landscape a little bit here in the UK. We offer non-biased, how can I put it? It's basically, we are set up as an educational platform to teach doctors about cannabis medicines. We produce our own guidelines on prescribing, and we have regular meetings and seminars where we discuss new areas of research and interesting subjects within the cannabis space. We also, once you're a member, you can join a forum. So we have a Google group for doctors that's all secure and it's anonymous with patient data, but we can actually discuss prescribing. So you know, we talk about specific cases or specific conditions, and you know, we get advice from colleagues overseas as well who are aligned with our society. So essentially, it's offering a platform for all doctors and all specialists in the UK, and also it's open to any other allied healthcare professionals. So we've got pharmacists, physiotherapists, healthcare assistant, pharmacists, medical students. We're also putting together a patient committee as well, advisory committee. So we'd like to work with patient groups. The Primary Care Cannabis Network was actually set up by myself, and that was really to address this, this need to educate GPs and teach them more about cannabis and CBD, and really kind of share my knowledge with my peers, try and get the message out that we need to learn more about this and we need to understand it better. So the Primary Care Cannabis Network is primarily for GPs, but we also have pharmacists and nurses, and we work with patient groups. So it's a similar type of organisation, but it's just focused on GPs.
Brilliant. Well, I applaud the work that you're doing. It sounds like you're doing everything you can to really push this forward and really support, you know, other healthcare professionals who are sort of perhaps new to this space and new to cannabis medicines. So that's fantastic. I guess if you could say anything to GPs who are sort of new to cannabis and just beginning their sort of education, their understanding of this, you know, what would that be? How would you sort of start to direct them, perhaps?
So, number one, I would say just drop the stigma, like any kind of preconceptions that you have about cannabis, just try and put those to the side and forget about that, because we don't seem to have the same approach to the poppy and opium plant. You know, with all the opioids that we prescribe, somehow we've kind of removed that idea that most of these medicines come from a plant, but we haven't managed to do that with cannabis. So, you know, I'd say just, you know, put that to one side and start to understand the plant and the cannabinoids, the endocannabinoid system. Start to look beyond the immediate, you know, beyond the UK. So look elsewhere and see, you know, where it's being used and how it's being used, and understand the fact that it's a botanical medicine at the moment. Apart from the few products that have gone through licensing, like Epidiolex and some of the synthetic cannabinoids, it's a botanical medicine largely as things stand. It's not. It takes a slightly different approach to prescribing and understanding it, and that it's more of a tailored way of prescribing to an individual. It might not work for one person, or it's perhaps a bit of trial and error. But you know, the data so far suggests it's very safe and it has very few side effects if it's used properly. So you know, I think when compared to the alternatives that we're used to prescribing, then there's clearly you know, it certainly matches, if not trumps, a lot of other medications that we're routinely just churning out in general practice. And I'd also say question your prescribing habits. So, you know, we know that we shouldn't be prescribing strong opioids for chronic non-cancer related pain, but we are, as a collective body of GPs. Too many patients are on medications that are either not beneficial for their condition or potentially they're harmful. And I think prescribing practice has actually got way out of hand in that we're not potentially doing the right thing for a lot of our patients. And that's perhaps a different discussion in its own right. And there's many reasons why that's happening. But I just think that there's a place for this in a clinical setting if it's done properly. And it could be very helpful for lots of patients.
Yeah, I think what you're hitting on there potentially is that we're obviously here in the UK, we look to the US a lot when it comes to, well, everything, but healthcare is one of those things. And I guess they are in the midst of, or potentially in the process of recovering from an opiate crisis. And that's something we don't want to replicate here in the UK.
Yeah, we're at risk, in some areas of matching what they're doing over in the US with our opioid prescribing level. The other thing to point out is that it's understandable why doctors don't know a lot about cannabis, and it's because we're not taught it in medical school. And actually, I think that there is a need for sort of standardized or accredited training in cannabis prescribing, cannabis medicine, that comes from a non-biased, educational standpoint, perhaps even that involves a large university or, NHS England, or there are things happening out there. There are some basic training modules, but I think that needs to be ramped up, and we need doctors to feel like they're actually getting very clear evidence-based training that kind of, so they feel reassured that this is non-biased and it's kind of coming from a good source, a good place. So they're ultimately, they feel confident in the subject, and that they feel happy prescribing. And that, I'm sure that will happen in time as well. We're starting to see things happening here and elsewhere. So clearly there's a huge need now to educate. But doctors like to learn, and it's part of our GMC duty. It's part of our appraisal process. So I often think, well, even if you're, if you're not, you're still against cannabis as a medicine. Most doctors I know are, they're smart and they like to learn and they're interested in things. So learn about it, or just come and come to one of our seminars, or do an online learning or something like that, because it's interesting. It's really interesting.
Sure, and the potential to help your patients is sort of there and evident. And I'm sure that a lot of sort of doctors out there will have patients who are coming to them and talking about this and potentially requesting it. So I guess it's empowering yourselves to deal with those scenarios, even if you can't prescribe per se. It's still having that knowledge.
Coming from a place of ignorance when it comes to a subject that is now so widely being discussed, you need to know the basics, if not a bit more than that, so you know more than your patient.
How important do you think it is that sort of that education for perhaps GPs and prescribers is coming from a sort of standardized or a pre-existing medical authority? I mean, obviously you guys are providing some education in the absence of that, and it's fantastic and it's much needed work. But in terms of the perceptions of doctors and prescribers, do you feel like they'd feel more confident if it was coming from NHS England?
Yeah, 100%. I think it needs to come from NHS England or a university, and it needs to be backed up, with doctors need to feel comfortable knowing, what they're learning and where it's coming from, or similar to any other thing that we learn through medical school and medical training. So I think that's really important, because I think, understandably, doctors sometimes skeptical, or they just expect a certain level of transparency, and that's fine. I mean, there are resources out there. There's plenty of useful resources, but there are also other platforms out there that are teaching about cannabis, but they may have been put together by a licensed producer or large cannabis company, and that obviously comes with problems. So, but yeah, there's clearly a strong need now for wider education. I've actually met many medical students now who are really interested in this, and they're starting to kind of even bring it up with their tutors at medical schools that they want more training in cannabis medicine, because they're really, I think the younger generation of students and doctors are really tuned into this, and they appreciate that this will become more mainstream and part of regular medical training and education. So that's promising. That's very promising.
Do you think there is perhaps a generational aspect here in terms of our acceptance of cannabis in a medical setting? I suppose I mean, perhaps this comes from, and something else I wanted to touch on a little bit. You mentioned stigma, and you sort of real message to doctors. The first thing you said was drop the stigma, and I, very happy to hear you say that, because it's something that I see, every single day in the work that I do with patients. In fact, I'll very briefly touch on it. I had a phone call yesterday from a patient who was inquiring about how the private systems work. They were in a situation where they were in tears, they were desperate, and they had been in a terrible car accident when they were younger, had chronic pain, all of their life, and just the only thing that had worked for them was cannabis, and they were clearly using it illicitly or finding their own sources. And from what I was hearing, it was their parents and their family members and their friends, and everyone in their circle was essentially judgmental of their use of something that wasn't being done for shits and giggles. excuse my French. We'll have to put that out for the podcast. But it's being done for their serious health reasons, and that lack of understanding and that stigma. I could hear the frustration that this young man had been driven to, and obviously it's an upsetting thing to have to deal with that. And I know I have personal experience. I mean, it's difficult trying to convince your mum that you're using cannabis every day for a medical condition, and that you're essentially being forced into criminality. And I think that stigma and the impact that has on patients is incredibly detrimental. And I wonder if that's part of the reason that there is resistance to prescribing and learning about cannabis medicines in the sort of perhaps the older generations, or the doctors who've been medical professionals for a number of years, sans any legal access to cannabis.
Yeah, no, there's clearly a large, widespread stigma around cannabis use. I think, as an observation, I found that the fact that it's becoming so widespread now across the world, and its usage, and CBD and hemp, and the fact that many countries now have allowed, they've legalized recreational cannabis. I think we're starting to slowly move away from seeing this as just a bad thing and a negative plant, a negative thing. I think there's clearly a younger generation of patients, millennials, Generation Z, as they're referred to, who are more health conscious, perhaps more open-minded about alternative types of treatments. Talk more freely about mental health and meditation and mindfulness and things. So I think that's all going to work very well with a kind of a younger generation of doctors coming through. I've also noticed a lot of older patients who are, when I say older, I'm talking about kind of say mid-60s onwards, who are interestingly very open to medical cannabis treatments. When you my view on it is, look, every point in our lives, whether you're a doctor, it makes a difference. We all become patients at one point in our lives, and we're all sat on the other side of the table opposite a doctor, and we're either suffering terribly, in pain, or we've some awful, life is life. We all become patients at some point. And I think actually, even people that perhaps in their younger years had this stigma and this negative connotation around cannabis, when they're suffering, or when you're suffering as an individual, you're open to anything if it's an option. So a lot of older people, I think, are really open to it. And if you look overseas, I keep referring to, but that actually a lot of people are, more elderly who are using cannabis. So I know in Israel there's widespread studies now in nursing homes with patients with agitation and dementia, and who are using cannabis, medical cannabis. I think it's actually opening up now and becoming much more acceptable to discuss as a potential therapeutic option for people of all ages now.
Yeah,
so,
I do think we're at a tipping point.
Really,
yeah, I do think we're at a tipping point. We're in that sort of understanding.
Exactly. So yeah, I think there's still a stigma, but we're moving through that slowly. And look, I think we'll look back in a few years and just think, okay, what was all the excitement about? What was all the fuss about?
Yeah, I completely agree.
Because let's be honest, it's heading in one direction. It's going to become more mainstream. It's going to be used widely, and it's going to be controlled and monitored, and hopefully in the hands of the right people and the right prescribers. I think it's interesting to think about an office of medical cannabis, because in Holland and Israel, and I think in a few other countries, there's a sort of governing body that oversees the whole space, really, and domestically. And I think that would be really useful here in the UK, because at the moment it's a little bit haphazard. It's kind of, there's private clinics popping up, or various kind of things happening out there, and actually to have a governing kind of a body that oversees the whole domestic space, I think would be really interesting and really useful. And also, there's clearly there are also economic benefits potentially for the UK to have its own domestic industry where it's growing, cultivating cannabis and hemp. So
I think we're about to start seeing that. That is happening, isn't it?
What's that, Alex?
I was going to say that seems to be sort of starting as well in UK domestic supply and things like that.
Yeah.
Seem to be. We had Eric Bystrom from Cellen on the show on our first episode, and he was talking about formulating oils here in the UK specifically for patients, and having that sort of quite a quick sort of turnaround time from prescription written for perhaps an unusual ratio, and then be able to get that to a patient within, I think it was about 3 days. But so that, I mean, that for me is going to be a tipping point when we start seeing
that would drive costs down as well. So,
exactly.
That's where I think NICE will have to reevaluate this idea that it's not cost effective. So that's obviously a slightly separate area from clinical medicine, but I think it's worth touching on and discussing because, especially in the times we're going through with Brexit and COVID and so on, it could be a really amazing kind of opportunity for the UK to lead the way with this in every aspect, in academic research and clinical trials and producing high quality products. So it's an amazing opportunity.
I completely agree. I think that might be the perfect place to end this episode on. I think you've painted a rather a picture of a lot of positivity for the future. And I know we've sort of touched on the hurdles and the barriers, but it's wonderful to know that there are individuals like yourself who really understand the needs of patients here, but also the needs of doctors, particularly GPs at the front line, that need for education, that need for you mentioned like an office of medical cannabis, like they have in the Netherlands or Holland, and I would applaud that as well. I think that would be having some sort of regulatory authority to really bolster the industry and provide that sort of unbiased place for education, information, and support for healthcare professionals as well. But in the meantime, it's fantastic that we've got organizations like Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society and the Primary Care Cannabis Network. And please keep doing the work that you're doing, and let's keep moving this forward. It's fantastic that we have people like yourself in this industry who aren't necessarily able to engage directly in terms of you can't write prescriptions, but still very much fascinated by it, very much passionate about moving things forward in the right way.
No, thank you for having me, Alex. It's been a really enjoyable conversation. So thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for tuning in with us today on the Grow Conversations podcast. Leon, what are the websites? I always forget this off. What are the websites for Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society and Primary Care? If people do want to learn more.
UKMCCS.org. So the Medical Cannabis Society is UKMCCS.org, and Primary Care Cannabis Network is www.primarycarecannabisnetwork.com. Brilliant.
Thank you so much, Leon. Thank you for joining us on the show. Sorry about a few sort of technical hiccups there. The downsides of doing things via video calls, and perhaps we can have you on the show later on down the line, and we'll be in the same room sharing a coffee or something. So thank you so much for joining us, Leon. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you all on the next episode of the Grow Conversations podcast.